Mark Sterling had everything: wealth, power, control, until a stranger burst into his office with 3 little girls and a lie so convincing, it almost hid the one truth that would change his life forever. Mark Sterling was used to quiet power. His office, perched high above the city, was designed to impress without needing to speak: steel, glass, and rich wood, minimalist but commanding. People didn't raise their voices here. They didn't storm in. Everything in his world happened by appointment, by approval, on his terms. That's why, when the door burst open mid-morning and a woman he didn't recognize marched in, dragging 3 little girls behind her, Mark didn't know what to react to first: her audacity, her anger, or the way the girls looked like they'd stepped out of someone else's life entirely. The woman was unkempt but bold. Her black hair hung in tangled waves, and her dark eyes locked onto Mark like he owed her something. She wore a jacket too thin for the weather and carried a worn-out bag that looked as exhausted as she did. The girls behind her stood silently. They were around 6 years old, maybe younger, and they looked so much alike it was impossible to ignore: triplets. All 3 had soft blonde hair, large blue eyes, and pale pink jackets that didn't quite match but tried to. "You don't get to ignore us anymore," the woman snapped. "These girls are yours, Mark. I've had enough. It's time you take responsibility." Mark stared at her, completely still. His assistant had frozen in the doorway behind them, horrified. He looked from the woman to the girls and then back again. "I'm sorry, who are you?" he asked, his voice low and controlled. "You don't remember me?" "Typical," she said bitterly. "My name's Carla. We met years ago. Had a thing. You left." "I didn't." She gestured dramatically toward the children. "These are your daughters. Triplets. I've raised them alone for years. But I'm done. You're rich. You can afford to help now. And I'm not leaving until you do." Mark blinked. He couldn't remember a Carla. He remembered many women, short connections, fleeting encounters, none that had led to anything real. He looked again at the children. Their blue eyes stared back at him, wide and quiet, their expressions unreadable. And suddenly he felt something shift deep in his chest. Still, his logical mind kicked in. "If what you're saying is true, we'll take a test. That's the only way to verify anything." Carla crossed her arms. "Fine. But you're paying for everything. I've had enough years of struggling alone." He buzzed his assistant. "Arrange for a paternity test immediately. Get legal on standby." Carla smirked. "You'll see. They're yours." The girls hadn't spoken a word. They stood close together, shoulder to shoulder, as if holding each other up. Mark noticed how one of them was clutching a small stuffed rabbit. The middle one had her eyes fixed on his desk. The third, the smallest, was staring straight at him. There was no fear in her gaze. Just something careful, something searching. He told Carla to wait in the lounge while the girls stayed in the care of his assistant. As she left the office with visible frustration, Mark sat back in his chair and exhaled slowly. His heart was pounding in a way it hadn't in years. He didn't know who these children really were. But something about them felt painfully familiar. Something in their eyes wouldn't let him look away. Mark stood by the large windows of his office, trying to collect his thoughts, but the calm view of the skyline couldn't ground him the way it usually did. The moment the door had closed behind the woman, Carla, as she claimed to be, the room had shifted. It wasn't the space that had changed, but something in him. He had built his life to be immovable, insulated, a fortress of control and logic. Yet now, only feet away, were 3 little girls with faces that looked just enough like his to rattle that entire foundation. He walked slowly to the hallway where the girls sat with his assistant in the reception area. They were huddled together on the couch, quiet and unsure, their bodies close as if they only felt safe when touching. His assistant had given them juice boxes and some crackers, but they hadn't touched the food. They didn't speak unless spoken to, and even then, they answered with cautious, short responses. Mark watched them for a moment from the doorway without making his presence known. There was a softness to them, an uncertainty that cut deeper than he expected. These weren't children used to demanding things. They were used to waiting. Used to being told what to do. He stepped into the room, and their eyes shifted to him in unison. "I just wanted to make sure you're comfortable," he said, his voice softer than usual. "Do you need anything?" The girl in the middle, Jane, he would later learn, shook her head. One of the others glanced toward the hallway, perhaps wondering if the angry woman would come back. The smallest girl looked directly at him again, the same way she had earlier, with unnerving focus. After a long pause, she stood up and walked over to him. She was barely up to his waist, but she moved with surprising certainty. "You're not mean," she said quietly, as if testing the words. "She is." Her tone wasn't fearful. It was matter-of-fact. Mark knelt down slowly to her level. "Who is she?" he asked, trying not to lead. "Carla," the girl answered. "She's not our mommy." The words landed like stone. Behind him, his assistant gasped. Mark kept his eyes on the child's. "What do you mean?" he asked, keeping his tone calm. "She said you were her daughters." The girl shook her head. "She told us to pretend. That we had to say you were our daddy. She said if we did it right, we'd get toys and a big house. But we don't want a big house. We want the real mommy." Her voice cracked on the last words. Mark felt something deep inside him fracture. He stood and immediately called security, instructing them not to let Carla leave the building under any circumstances. He then contacted law enforcement and child protective services. This was no longer a question of paternity, it was a criminal investigation. As Carla was detained by security downstairs, the police arrived swiftly, and social workers came soon after to speak to the girls. Mark stayed close by. He didn't leave them alone. He couldn't. Each girl was interviewed separately. Lacey, Jane, and Bella. Each of them said the same thing. They didn't know Carla. She had picked them up from somewhere they didn't recognize, told them to keep quiet, and brought them to this building with a promise that if they followed instructions, they'd be rewarded. Mark watched the interviews from the side with growing anger, not just at Carla, but at himself. For not asking more questions from the beginning. For being so wrapped up in logic that he didn't immediately act on instinct when he saw fear in their eyes. But what scared him more than anything else was how easily those girls had followed Carla's directions, not out of trust, but out of necessity. They had survived by listening, by obeying, by becoming invisible. By the time evening came, Carla had been taken into custody. Her story collapsed under questioning. She had no connection to the children, no documents, no legal rights. Just a long history of petty fraud and a desperate plan to extort a wealthy man using vulnerable children. The girls were now officially wards of the state, but the social worker admitted there was a complication. No one knew who they were. They didn't appear in missing persons reports. No birth certificates had surfaced yet. It was as if they didn't exist on paper. Mark didn't hesitate. He asked to take temporary custody until a proper guardian could be found. The social worker was surprised, even cautious, but after a full day of statements and cooperation, and with nowhere else for the children to go, she agreed. That night, the three girls sat in the back seat of Mark's car as he drove them home. They didn't ask where they were going. They didn't speak much at all. But when they reached his house and he opened the door for them, each one walked in slowly, taking in the tall ceilings, the quiet hallways, the warm light spilling from the kitchen. And though none of them said it out loud, something about the way they all looked back at him before walking farther inside told him the same thing. They had no idea what this place was yet. But they wanted it to be home. The morning after the girls moved in, Mark woke up earlier than usual, not because of an alarm or a meeting, but because something in him was restless. The house was still quiet, but it felt different. No longer just a pristine, high-end space built for solitude, it now held the energy of presence, of little feet that had walked softly down the hall, of small breaths rising and falling in unfamiliar beds. He got out of bed, not sure what to expect, and padded down the hallway toward the guest rooms. One door was cracked open, and inside, he saw all three girls curled up in the same bed, tangled together beneath a thick blanket. The nightlight glowed beside them, casting soft shadows on the walls. They looked peaceful, but not entirely relaxed, like they had learned to sleep light, always ready to run or wake if something went wrong. He quietly backed away and went to the kitchen, unsure of what to make but feeling like he should try something. He wasn't used to cooking. His kitchen was usually used by staff, rarely by him. Still, he pulled out a pan and attempted pancakes, though they came out slightly burned on the edges. As the scent spread through the house, he heard footsteps behind him. It was Lacey, the bold one, with her hair sticking out at odd angles from sleep. She stared at the pan, then at him, and asked, "Are those for us?" He turned and nodded. "They might not be perfect, but they're warm." Lacey shrugged and climbed onto a stool at the counter. Jane and Bella joined a few minutes later, quieter, but clearly watching his every move. He placed plates in front of them and poured orange juice into glasses. The girls started eating cautiously, and he noticed how they didn't ask for anything, not even syrup. They didn't complain. They were just grateful. After breakfast, he gave them a short tour of the house, not because it was large and impressive, but because he wanted them to know where everything was. Where the extra blankets were. Which cabinet had cereal. How to call him from the landline if something ever scared them. Each time he showed them something simple, like the button for the TV or the shelf where books were kept, he saw the smallest flashes of awe in their eyes. It wasn't the objects that amazed them. It was the attention. The permission to belong. Later that morning, a representative from Child Protective Services arrived for a scheduled home visit. She was there to check on the girls, to confirm that the environment was safe and suitable for temporary guardianship. Mark answered her questions calmly, gave her a full tour, and let her speak with the girls privately. He paced outside the room during the conversations, trying not to eavesdrop, but his nerves made his chest tight. When she finished and came to speak with him, she said, "They feel safe here." That's not always the case in situations like this. Whatever you're doing, it's working. After she left, Mark sat in his office and stared at the paternity report he had requested but hadn't yet submitted. He hadn't told the girls about it. Part of him still needed to know. Part of him was afraid of what he might learn. But another part, a deeper part, already knew the truth. He saw it in their eyes, in the curve of Bella's cheek, in Jane's thoughtful expressions, in Lacey's stubborn confidence. They were his. Maybe not just by blood. Maybe by something more binding, choice. That afternoon, the girls helped him clean up the living room. They insisted on organizing the bookshelf by color. Jane found a book about stars and asked if she could read it at bedtime. That night, when they lay down, he sat at the edge of the bed and read slowly, his voice even, watching as their eyes began to droop. Lacey was the last to fall asleep, and before she did, she whispered, "You're better than the last house." He looked at her and asked gently, "What do you mean?" She blinked slowly. "We were in a place before. Lots of rules. They yelled a lot. But no one ever tucked us in there." He didn't know what to say, so he just pulled the blanket a little tighter around her and stayed until her breathing evened out. After they were asleep, he sat alone in the hallway outside their door for a long time. He didn't scroll through his phone. He didn't check emails. He just sat there, grounded by the silence, listening to the sounds of a house that finally felt like it had a heartbeat. The next few days settled into a strange, beautiful routine. Mark, once known for his calculated mornings and back-to-back meetings, now found himself waking up to the sound of soft footsteps and quiet giggles from the hallway. The girls were still careful, still testing the space, but every day they grew a little more open, a little more trusting. He noticed it in small things, how Bella started humming while brushing her teeth, how Jane began leaving her drawings on his desk, and how Lacey no longer followed him silently but asked questions, dozens of them, about everything. Mark found that his work mattered less now. He cancelled unnecessary meetings and delegated tasks he once refused to let go of. His team was confused, some even concerned, but he didn't care. He didn't explain. All that mattered to him was that 3 little girls were in his house, calling it home in their own quiet way, and he wasn't going to let them down. One afternoon, after lunch and a messy art session that ended with glitter all over the kitchen table, Mark sat with the girls in the living room. Jane was drawing in her notebook, Bella was curled up with a stuffed animal, and Lacey was flipping through a book she couldn't quite read yet. Without looking up, she asked, "Are we going to stay here forever?" The question hit him like a stone, because he had been thinking about the same thing. He set his coffee down and leaned forward. "Do you want to stay?" he asked. Lacey shrugged, but Jane spoke softly. "It's the first place we don't feel like we have to be quiet all the time." That night, after the girls had fallen asleep, Mark sat at his desk with the DNA test kit still unopened in front of him. He'd been avoiding it, telling himself it didn't matter, that he didn't need blood to know what he already felt. But something about that question, "Are we going to stay forever?" made him realize that even if it didn't change how he saw them, it might help protect them. Legally. Permanently. He opened the kit and followed the instructions carefully. Swabs, labels, envelopes. It was strange to reduce something so emotional to a clinical process, but he did it. He scheduled the drop-off for the next morning and went to bed later than usual, staring at the ceiling, wondering what the girls would think if he ever told them he had doubted. Not them, but himself. The next day, while the samples were being processed, he took the girls on a small trip. It wasn't extravagant, just a visit to the Children's Museum across town, followed by ice cream and a long walk through the park. He watched as they ran through the interactive exhibits, chasing light displays and laughing in a way that made strangers smile. A woman passed by and said, "You have beautiful daughters." He started to correct her, but stopped. "Thank you," he said instead, and it felt right. On the way home, they all fell asleep in the car. He didn't turn on music. He drove in silence, letting the sound of their quiet breathing fill the space. When he pulled into the driveway, he didn't wake them right away. He just sat there, watching their peaceful faces, trying to understand how he had lived so many years without this. That evening, he received a call. The test results would be ready by the next morning. He thanked the lab technician and stood in the hallway, staring at the photos Jane had taped to the wall, crayon drawings of the 4 of them together, stick figures with big smiling faces and a house in the background. One of the figures was taller, with a tie and a coffee cup. It was him. Underneath it, she had written in uneven handwriting, "Our dad." He didn't need the results to believe it anymore. But he knew they were coming. And whatever they said, he had already made his decision. He was staying. They were staying. And he would fight to make it forever. The DNA results arrived early the next morning, delivered in a sealed envelope by a courier who had no idea what he was carrying. Mark held the envelope for a long time before opening it. It felt too light for how heavy it truly was. The girls were still asleep, the house quiet, and the morning sun had just started to peek through the windows. He stood by the kitchen counter, tore the edge open, and slid the folded document out with slow, steady hands. His eyes scanned the lines, looking for the only words that mattered. The conclusion was simple, printed in bold black letters: probability of paternity, 99.9%. He didn't sit down. He didn't react outwardly. He just stared at the words, letting the confirmation settle in a place he had already made space for days ago. They were his. Not just in a legal or biological sense, but in the deeper way that had grown between them every hour they spent together. The girls were his daughters, and now the rest of the world would have to recognize it, too. Later that morning, when the girls came into the kitchen in their pajamas, he was already cooking breakfast. Pancakes again, this time a little less burned. Bella clung to her stuffed animal while Jane climbed up onto the stool and asked if they could go to the park later. Lacey didn't say anything at first, just watched him with the kind of look that saw more than most adults ever could. Mark turned around and smiled, deciding to wait on telling them. Not because they didn't deserve the truth, but because he knew they needed to hear it at the right moment, in the right way. After breakfast, he called his attorney and began the process of filing for full legal custody. It would take time, and there would be interviews, home inspections, and a pile of paperwork, but none of it deterred him. Every box he checked, every line he signed, brought them one step closer to safety, to permanence, to never having to be moved or claimed or questioned again. Later that week, he brought the girls to a quiet cafe near the park. It was the kind of place where no one asked questions, and the back table was tucked away with just enough privacy. They sat with hot cocoa and muffins, the girls giggling and chatting about the museum they wanted to visit next. Mark waited for a lull in their conversation and then gently reached into his jacket pocket. He pulled out the folded result sheet and laid it on the table. "I want to show you something," he said carefully. The girls fell silent. Jane leaned in first, reading the top line with wide eyes. Lacey looked at him, not the paper, already guessing what it meant. Bella stayed quiet, her fingers curled around her cup. "This test," Mark said softly, "proves that you're not just in my home, you're mine. My daughters. All three of you." The reaction wasn't what he expected. There were no shouts of excitement, no sudden hugs. Instead, Jane's lower lip began to tremble. "So we really belong?" she asked, her voice breaking. Mark reached across the table, took her hand gently, and nodded. "You always did. Now everyone else knows it too." Bella started crying softly, and Lacey pulled her close. Then she looked at Mark with a mix of emotion he would never forget, something between relief and awe. "Does that mean no one can take us away now?" "No one," he said firmly. "Not ever again." That night, when they were back home, the girls pulled their mattresses into his bedroom without asking. They didn't want to sleep far from him. Instead of sending them back, he helped them build a blanket fort right there on the floor. They lay in their sleeping bags while he read to them, the sound of their breathing steady and calm. When he turned off the light, Lacey's voice came from the dark. "You didn't have to do all this, you know." Mark paused, lying back on his pillow. "I know," he said. "But I wanted to. Because you're worth it." And for the first time since they had walked into his office, he felt something shift, not just in the girls, but in himself. It wasn't fear or guilt or obligation anymore. It was love. The quiet, permanent kind that required nothing in return. Just the choice to stay. In the weeks that followed, Mark's life began to transform in ways he never could have predicted. The change wasn't loud or dramatic, but it was constant, unfolding in the details he used to overlook. His mornings no longer began with stock reports and black coffee but with hairbrushes tangled in curls, serial debates, and the sleepy shuffle of three girls deciding who got to sit next to him at breakfast. The penthouse, once a model of luxury and order, now looked like a home lived in by children, crayon drawings taped to the refrigerator, a growing collection of shoes scattered near the entryway, and tiny socks hiding in the corners of the couch cushions. Mark had expected chaos, and there was plenty of it, but what he hadn't expected was the quiet joy that came with it. Every time Bella reached for his hand during walks, every time Jane asked him to read just one more chapter, every time Lacey rolled her eyes at his poor pancake skills but ate every bite anyway, it chipped away at the walls he had spent years building around himself. He wasn't the same man who had once chosen silence over connection. He was becoming someone else, someone better. He adjusted his work schedule around the girls, shifting meetings and stepping away from the day-to-day operations of his company. It startled some of his colleagues, confused others, but Mark didn't feel the need to explain. He had made millions, negotiated some of the biggest deals in the industry, and yet none of that compared to watching three children fall asleep knowing they were safe. He was no longer living for the next big acquisition. He was living for bedtime stories, school drop-offs, and surprise hugs from girls who had finally started calling him Dad without hesitation. The process of gaining full legal custody was underway. Social workers made their visits, neighbors provided character references, and Mark submitted every document required without complaint. At one point, a caseworker asked him directly why he was doing this. His answer was simple: because no one else will ever love them the way I do. And it was the truth. He began to learn more about the girls, not just their habits or preferences, but their fears, their memories, their stories. Lacey had trouble sleeping through the night and often wandered into his room just to make sure he was still there. Jane was deeply curious and loved astronomy, often reading books far beyond her age level and asking questions he couldn't always answer. Bella was quieter than the other two, but deeply empathetic. She noticed when he was tired, when someone was sad, and offered small comforts, a drawing, a whispered joke, or simply sitting beside him in silence. One night, as he tucked them into bed, Bella pulled a folded piece of paper from beneath her pillow. She handed it to him with a shy smile. It was a drawing of their family, four stick figures standing in front of a house. Above them was a sun, too big for the sky, and under the picture were the words, "We belong." Mark stared at it for a long time, his throat tightening, and then kissed the top of her head. "You always did," he whispered. Later that same week, the girls' school hosted a family breakfast event. Mark hadn't planned to go at first. He assumed it was something other parents attended, the kind who packed lunches with handwritten notes and knew how to braid hair in perfect symmetry. But the girls begged him to come, and so he did. He wore jeans instead of a suit, helped the girls find their classroom, and sat with them as they proudly introduced him to their teacher. Other parents watched curiously, and he heard one whisper, "That's Mark Sterling, isn't it?" but he ignored it. He was too busy listening to Bella read aloud, too focused on helping Jane glue glitter stars to a construction paper moon, too proud when Lacey announced, "This is my dad," as if it were the most obvious truth in the world. That night, as they all sat curled on the couch under one blanket watching a movie, Mark realized he didn't feel like he was filling in for someone else or pretending to be what he wasn't. He felt whole. He had given them a home, but they had given him something greater, a reason to live beyond himself. The man who once measured his life in profit margins and performance graphs now measured it in bedtime kisses and the sound of little voices yelling, "Dad," from across the room. And for the first time in his adult life, Mark Sterling no longer felt alone. It happened on an ordinary Thursday afternoon, the kind of day Mark had come to cherish. The girls were at school, he had just finished a video call with his legal team regarding the custody process, and the house was unusually quiet. He had just started to make himself a late lunch when the doorbell rang. Expecting a delivery, he answered casually, but the man standing on the other side of the door was not a courier. He was tall, unshaven, with hard eyes and a smile that didn't reach them. He wore a faded jacket and held a thick envelope in one hand. Mark knew instantly that something was off. The man introduced himself as Raymond Carter. Mark had never heard the name before. The man's tone was too casual, like he was testing the ground beneath him. Then he said something that shifted the air in the room. "I'm here for my son. I heard you've been keeping him." Confused, Mark raised an eyebrow. "You're mistaken. I don't have a son." Raymond smiled slightly. "Not the way you think. But I think we both know you've got 3 girls in this house, and one of them came from a woman I knew real well. Rachel. The youngest one. Bella. She's mine." Mark's stomach turned. Rachel. That was the name he had read in the letter from the woman who worked at the shelter, the girl's biological mother, now gone. He had assumed she had no living family. This man hadn't been mentioned. There had been no record of a father listed. But Raymond went on, claiming he had proof, pulling out a page from the envelope that looked like an old birth certificate with his name scribbled in. He said Rachel left with the baby without his permission, that she lied about everything, and now he wanted compensation. That word stuck. Mark stayed calm, though every nerve in his body was on edge. "You're not here for Bella," he said plainly. "You're here for a payday." Raymond didn't deny it. He laughed, called it business, and said he'd already spoken to someone in the press. "You wouldn't want a scandal, Mr. Sterling. I'm sure the public would be very curious about how you adopted a bunch of orphans and kept it quiet." It was a threat, clear and ugly. Mark didn't yell. He didn't slam the door. He simply said, "If you come near my family again, you'll speak to my attorney. And the police." Then he shut the door in the man's face. His heart was racing. He stood still for a full minute, trying to keep himself grounded. This wasn't just about legal battles anymore. This was someone trying to rip away what he had only just begun to build. But Mark wasn't the same man he had been months ago. He didn't panic. He picked up the phone, called his lawyer, and explained everything. Within 48 hours, restraining orders were filed. Security around the property was tightened. Mark informed the social worker and the judge overseeing the custody petition. His team dug into Raymond's past and found a history of arrests, unpaid debts, and no actual documentation of paternity. What he did have was a pattern. He had pulled similar stunts with other vulnerable families in the past. And now he had seen a wealthy man and tried to play a dangerous game. Mark didn't tell the girls right away. He didn't want them to be afraid. But that night, when he tucked them in, Bella asked, out of nowhere, "Will anyone ever try to take us again?" Her voice was small, uncertain. He sat beside her, brushing her hair back gently. "No one will ever take you from me," he said. "No matter what it costs me, I will protect you. You're safe here. Always." She nodded but didn't look convinced. And that broke something in him. She had lived too much life for her age, and he hated that she even had to ask. After they fell asleep, he stayed up going over every document, every form, making sure nothing could be challenged. He contacted a therapist for the girls the next day, just in case they ever sensed something wasn't right. He wanted them to have a voice, even if they didn't know how to use it yet. The storm passed faster than he thought it would. With legal intervention and background checks, Raymond vanished as quickly as he had come. But Mark knew this wouldn't be the last test. People saw money, they saw weakness, they saw opportunity. What mattered now was that he remained one step ahead. That he stayed the father the girls already believed he was. And as he watched them play in the garden that weekend, chasing bubbles and laughing under the sunlight, he made a vow in silence: he would never let anything from the past steal their future. Not again. Not ever. Spring arrived gently that year, bringing with it a warmth that seemed to seep not just into the air but into the walls of Mark's home. Everything felt lighter, softer, as if the tension of the last few months had finally begun to loosen its grip. The girls had grown in ways both small and profound. Their laughter came quicker now, louder, unafraid. Their footsteps echoed confidently through the hallways. The once foreign routines of shared meals, bedtime stories, and school mornings had become the very structure of their lives, solid, dependable, filled with meaning. Mark had changed too, though he didn't always notice it in himself. He only saw it in reflection: how his staff no longer knocked before entering his office with personal matters, how he kept a paper flower on his desk that Bella had made, how he missed the sound of their voices even when they were only at school for a few hours. He no longer saw himself as a temporary presence in their lives. He was their father now, not just by DNA or legal decree, but by something deeper. He was the one they looked for in the crowd at school recitals, the one they called when they scraped a knee, the one they trusted to keep the night monsters away. The court date for final custody came sooner than expected. Mark had prepared for weeks, working closely with his attorney, assembling every document, every report, every glowing statement from teachers and social workers. But when the day finally arrived, he didn't feel nervous. He felt ready. The courtroom was quiet and formal, filled with rows of benches and polished wood. The girls sat beside him, dressed in matching soft blue dresses they had chosen themselves. They held hands, legs swinging just above the floor, and looked at the judge with wide, curious eyes. The judge, an older woman with a firm but kind expression, asked the necessary questions. She reviewed the file carefully, spoke directly to the girls, and then turned to Mark. "Why do you want to adopt these 3 children, Mr. Sterling?" she asked. Mark didn't look at his notes. He didn't need them. He looked at the girls, then back at the judge and answered, "Because I can't imagine life without them. Because they are my family in every way that matters. And because every child deserves someone who will fight to stay, no matter what." The room was silent for a beat, then the judge smiled and gave her ruling. The adoption was finalized. They were his daughters. Officially. Permanently. The girls didn't fully understand the legal weight of it, but they knew something important had just happened. Jane whispered, "Does this mean we'll never have to leave again?" And when Mark nodded, all 3 girls wrapped their arms around him at once. Afterward, he took them out for a celebration picnic in the city park. They brought cupcakes, juice boxes, and a blanket covered in sparkles. The girls ran in the grass, took turns climbing onto his back, and made up a song called "Our Forever Dad." Mark lay back on the blanket, watching the clouds drift overhead, and for the first time in years, felt completely still inside. He had spent his whole life chasing control, perfection, prestige. None of it had given him what these 3 small, brave girls had given him in less than a year: purpose, peace, and unconditional love. That evening, at home, Lacey brought out the memory box they had been building together, a collection of drawings, notes, photos, and tiny keepsakes. She added the judge's adoption decree to the top. Jane placed a drawing of their family beneath it, and Bella handed Mark a folded note. He opened it to find just 4 words in careful, uneven handwriting: "You made us whole." He didn't cry. Not then. He just smiled, pulled them into a hug, and whispered back, "You did the same for me." And in that quiet moment, surrounded by the life none of them had planned for but all of them had chosen, they became what they were always meant to be: a family. Whole. Real. Forever. What makes the ending of this story so powerful is its quiet triumph, not the kind built on dramatic twists or grand reveals, but the kind rooted in emotional growth, human connection, and earned love. Mark doesn't just adopt 3 girls, he transforms. He goes from a man who built his world on control and distance to someone who understands that real strength comes from vulnerability, presence, and choosing others over pride. The story doesn't pretend that healing is simple, but it proves that healing is possible when people choose each other, even after pain, even after fear. The girls, too, are more than just rescued children. They are the heart of the story, resilient, wise beyond their years, and quietly courageous. Their bond with Mark grows not because of DNA, but because he shows up every day, even when he's unsure. And that's what love really is, not perfection, but choice. The ending doesn't just feel happy. It feels earned. And in a world that often values success over softness, that's exactly the kind of ending we need.